We just created a really useful system to store files, and we put a lot of effort into getting all the files from the individual PCs onto the file server to centralize them. But now we want to make sure that we won't lose them in the event of a power outage or a disk failure or something catching on fire. So there's probably a whole bunch of interesting information that's taken a lot of time to build, spreadsheets, databases, whatever you might have, and we need to find a way to back it up. There is a built-in command called tar, and tar was originally designed to back up to a tape drive, but one of the options that you can feed tar is to save it to a file instead of a tape device. 99% of the backups in Linux that you're going to find use tar and some sort of compression, either gzip or bzip. And finally, in order to make it so that we don't ever have to touch the system, we're going to automate the backups using something called cron. Tar is the tape archiver, and in computing terms it's older than dirt. Tar has been around so long that you can find 20-year-old tape drives that still have the original tar file format on them. Tar has also kept up with the times a little bit. So one of the things that we no longer use really, especially in small offices, are tape drives. We use hard drives to back up anymore, and so tar has a way of saving things to a file. Since tar is old and very compatible, most people continue to use it for their backups. The one thing that's different about tar from what you're expecting is compared to a RAR file or a zip file or anything like that, is that tar combines files into a stream. And so it literally takes the first byte, the second byte, the third byte, and writes it to a virtual tape, which we're going to consider a file. But it doesn't do any compression natively. Normally, tape drives themselves do the compression, so there would be no point in tar doing it. But what tar does support is two command line options that vary the type of compression that it can apply after it's created the file. So one is gzip, and one is bzip2. And they work exactly the same way, you just change the command line slightly to pick between the two versions. Let's run through a couple of quick examples. It should be clear as water. I'm going to go ahead and use the intranet site as the example in this case. Maybe the coding guys have actually created some stuff for us and we don't want to lose it. So the first thing that we do, go to var www intranet, and we're going to issue the tar-cvf command. The first argument here is the file that we want to save all of the things to. And the second argument, which is the star, is the files that we want to actually put into the tar file. The -c indicates that we want to create. The -v indicates that it's a verbose listing, so it actually lists the files as they're compressed. And the -f indicates that the next argument is the file name that we want to save to. In the second example, we added in a z, and that tells it to use gzip compression. So in the end, you see that there are two examples. The first, which is just a .tar file, is about 10K, and it would contain the literal byte-for-byte representation of each of the files. The second file is a gzipped compressed version, which is much, much smaller. Backups are obviously useless without a way to recover them. So I made a new directory called restores, and we're going into restores, and we're going to decompress. The syntax is the same, except you use a -x instead of a c, x standing for extract. If we want to extract the compressed version, we could also use a z again. As a side note, just like a lot of other Linux applications, tar can work on standard in and standard out. So if you don't want to use -z for whatever reason, just to experiment with, you could also gunzip the file and then pipe that to tar-xv, not using an f, and then it would use the standard input as its source to decompress, and it will just decompress to the current directory. As it is, there's really no reason to do that. The -z or -j for bzip2 always works pretty well anyway. But now I want to create a real actual backup instead of just experimenting. So we need to figure out where all of our Samba files are being stored. The easiest way is to grep for path in the SMB config and look at the ones that we actually care about. In this case, everything that we want is under Mount File Server except the intranet files. So we could either deal with them separately, or we could figure out a way to get both of them in. In this case, we can do a tar-cvzf for file share backup and include both directories. And you'll note there that we have a lost and found cannot open permission denied. I'm not root, which is really not such an issue because I can still read the files. But even if I were root, lost and found is a special directory that you would generally want to avoid using. It comes from formatting the file system. We decompress it, and what you see here is that it's created mount and var, because tar creates the directory structure in a mirror from wherever you happen to call it. And it will always strip off the leading slash so that you don't overwrite real file system data. And to switch gears a little bit, now it's time to introduce another basic kind of bash feature. And this is classically called the backticks. And it's a way to execute a command inside of a command line and then substitute the output of the internal command into a string for the regular bash command line. I know it's confusing, but I think an example will help. What we would really like to do is have a way to tag every backup with the date that it was taken. And so the really simple way to do this is to use the backticks feature of bash and execute a built-in command called date, which allows you to print a dated format. What we do here is we go in and we insert a backtick character which shares the same key as the tilde and run date with some formatting criteria. You can see that in the output you get an 081011. What's going on here can be a little intimidating at first, so I'll try to explain it better. When you run something inside of backticks in the bash shell, what it does is it executes the command inside backticks first, and then that should always return a string of some type, a regular printable type of line. What it then does is take that printed line, that date, and then the format string of day, month, year returned, and then inserts it in the command line as if you had typed it yourself. So in this case, you ended up with a file share backup -081011.tgz or gzip to tar. Another important concept at this point to pick up on is how the different compression systems work. Gzip and bzip2, which I've already alluded to. We're copying the password, which is a known plain text file, and then we'll gzip it. And you can see between the two file sizes that it's now significantly smaller. We can then bzip it and see that the file sizes have changed yet again. So there's a slight difference between gzip and bzip. Normally bzip actually compresses better. This is a rare occasion that it doesn't. You can use either of them as normal compression algorithms, but you see that they only work on one file at a time, which is why we have to have a tarred file, tar combines files, and then gzip compresses them. The reason this is so important is twofold. One, you don't want to think of tar as like a zip file. Tar doesn't compress. And you don't want to think of gzip as like a zip file. It doesn't have multiple files in it. And worst of all, you don't want to be talking to someone in the industry and say, oh, I got a gzip of that a little bit ago. It's always a tar. Now, of course, it's time to make it more complicated with a program called cron. Cron is the periodic task scheduler in Linux, and it's used to configure certain times that you want a process to run. You can give it arguments, and if you run it as root, you can even give it the user to run as. But the general principle is if you want something to run every Saturday at 2 a.m. or every 15 minutes or every 37th day of the year, you would use cron to set that up. I want to use that here so that I can create my backups every morning automatically when no one's around, and we're going to use the fancy date trick so that we have versioned versions of the backup. Like fstab for file systems, you configure cron with a file called the crontab. It's a little different though. Every user has their own crontab, including root. There's also a global crontab that lives in etc crontab. The format of a crontab file is probably unlike anything you've ever seen before. And that's okay because you've been introduced to a lot of things you've never seen before in this video series. This one has probably the most archaic configuration language though. We'll go ahead and jump right into it with a bunch of examples. First of all, Linux cron can't run anything more frequently than once per minute. The format of the config file reflects that. So what you actually see, if you take a look at the first blue example, is a crontab entry that runs something.sh at 3:14 a.m. on the 3rd and the 23rd day of every month. So let's just take a minute to examine that. The first field, 14, is the number of minutes after the hour that you want it to run. The second field, the 3, is the number of hours after midnight that you want it to run. And then the 3, 23 are the 3rd and 23rd days of the month. The last 2 asterisks indicate that you want it to run every month and every day of the week. Move on down to the second blue example, and there's something configured there to run at 6 p.m. every Tuesday. So in the first column we have a 0, which means run at 0 minutes after the hour. We have an 18, which is the 24-hour clock version of 6 p.m. We have 2 stars, and those 2 stars mean that you want it to run every day of the month and every month. And then finally we have a 2, and if you start your week with Sunday equals 0, Monday equals 1, and Tuesday equals 2. The third example is a shorthand way of saying that you want the job to run every 15 minutes. The traditional way of doing that would have been to say 0, 15, 30, 45. But this is a shorthand that was introduced by Linux cron a couple of years ago. You may not find it on older Unix systems, and you certainly won't find it on really old ones. Finally, the last example looks like it's the most straightforward, but it may actually be the most interesting, in that it runs something every minute. But the star doesn't necessarily mean run every. What the star actually means is for every possible version of this, run the command. So for every possible value of minute, every possible value of hour, every possible value of day, it runs this command. So the effect is that it runs it once per minute. Let's go ahead and set up that first backup cron tab. It's time for a solid example. We want to go ahead and sudo root because we need root privileges to do the backups correctly. And I need to make a directory to dump the backups to. Crontab-E means edit the cron tab, and it's asking me which editor to pick. You'll notice now that my copy of Vi is in color. That's because I installed Vim previously, if you will think back to the Samba segment. So there's a cheat sheet built inside the cron tab by default. And what I really want to say is every morning at 3 a.m. I want to run this backup. I think it's safe to assume that most users won't be around at 3 a.m. in most sane businesses. So I'm going to take the command that I ran earlier literally and put it into this cron tab. atar-czvf, and we want to create a new backup in the mount backups directory that I just made using the date trick so that we can create multiple backups at the same time. That way you don't overwrite yesterday's backup with one that might not be valid. You can restore files from a couple of days ago or as long as you want. Once we think we've got this crontab set up correctly, go ahead and write it out. Crontab will actually do a sanity check when it reads its saved file. And if it doesn't make sense, it'll throw an error and ask you if you'd like to continue editing it or not. Generally, if you get that up, it probably means you screwed up either the time definition or the string command itself. What we can't neglect to do is back up our MySQL databases. Those are located in a special place in var lib MySQL, and there's a special command specifically designed to back up MySQL databases called MySQL dump. MySQL dump exports the entire database into an SQL file so that you can replay it on a new database. It's plain text, and it also compresses really well. So first we want to experiment with MySQL dump, and then we'll set up a cron job for it as well. The syntax for almost all of the MySQL related commands are the same. You can give it a -u and then a username and a -p to prompt you for a password. The only thing that we've done here additional is use -- all databases, which is going to dump clearly all of the databases. And normally what MySQL dump would do is throw all of the SQL to std out, which means to your terminal. We want to redirect that into a file. So we redirected it into mount backups MySQL dump, which we can see is 486K. We can then gzip it, and it should compress it really well because it's text. And it did. That's about a 33% compressed size. But what we don't want to do is do that as as 2 steps. We want to do it as 1 step. In the Unix world, that means we use a pipe. And so we're going to pipe the output of MySQL dump into gzip. And that will actually compress the data on the fly as it travels through the pipe. And since it's now compressed, we redirect it to a new file indicating that it is gzipped. And again, as a reminder, file extensions in Linux don't matter whatsoever. They are a convenience for you, the user. The operating system does not care in the least. Since we now know what command it's going to take to back up our database, namely a MySQL dump, pipe it to gzip to save some space, and then dump it somewhere, we can set up the cron tab to do the exact same thing. The difference is we want it to run at a different time from the normal backup. On a heavily loaded system, you want your database to dump as quickly as possible so that you have the most consistent data. There's no consistency check built into MySQL dump, so it just needs to be fast. Since this file is owned by root, the cron tab is owned by root, I feel fairly comfortable putting the actual password in. There are tricks that you could do to get around it, but as long as you're running this as root, you should be fine. I've decided to run it at 4 a.m., well after the file server should have tarred itself up. Of possible significance here is that I'm not using the date trick. I don't necessarily care about dated MySQL backups. Only the most recent one is interesting to me on this server. There are certainly instances where you would be doing a MySQL dump and would want to be able to do dated restores. But a lot of times if you need to do serious data modifications, some sort of migration, or you're updating a new application, you should do a MySQL dump before you start so that you can restore to the most recent viable version instead of having to restore from last night at 4 a.m.